I'm super excited about this conversation and the opportunity to be in conversation with all of these incredible, amazing scholars, artists, and activists. I just am just thrilled that we were able to bring this plenary session together on movement and movement building. And really the intention of this session is to bring together people who are approaching questions of movement and movement building from a range of kind of approaches as thinkers and practitioners, and to have us think really amply and I think critically about this question, the theme of the conference of Rican bodies. So our format for today is we're gonna hear from each of the panelists. They're going to give about 10 minutes of remarks. I will have some questions for the panelists intended to kind of put them into conversation, and then we'll have time for question and answer. So please feel free at any point during the session today to use the Q&A function to ask questions of the panel as a whole or for any of the individual panelists. So I'm going to go ahead and oh, I cannot minimize Zoom while I'm recording. Okay, so I'm trying to open up the bios for the panelists, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jade Power-Sotomayor. So Jade is a Cali Rican educator, scholar, and performer who works as an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at UC San Diego. Her research interests include Latinx theater and performance, dance studies, nightlife, epistemologies of the body, feminist of color critique, eco-dramaturgies, I think I said that maybe correct, bilingualism, and intercultural performance in the Caribbean diaspora. Dr. Power-Sotomayor is currently working on a monograph called Habla, Speaking Bodies in Latinx Dance and Performance, in which she theorizes her concept of embodied code switching across distinct Latinx social dance spaces. Publications can be found in TDR, Performance Matters, Latino Studies Journal, Latin American Theater Review, the Oxford Handbook of Theater and Dance, and Theater Journal. Her essays on the fandango fronticero and on bomba dancing have been recognized with awards from the Dance Studies Association, American Society for Theater Research, and the American Studies Association Sound Studies Caucus. In 2019, she co-edited a special issue of Centro Journal called Puerto Rican Bomba, Syncopating Bodies, Histories, Geographies, and collaborates on the Bomba Wiki project, a crowdsourced online Bomba archive. She is also a dramaturge, and co-directs and performs with the San Diego group Bomba Liberté. She is grateful to her many teachers and students for gifting her a lifelong experience of teaching. So I'll hand it over to Jade. Thank you.
Saludo. From San Diego, California, where we're still in the AM. Thank you, Marisol, PRSA, Jess, everyone, and my co-panelists. I'm really excited to hear from you all. Okay. Bodies confound us. We inhabit them intimately and are the first-hand experts on the experience of our own embodiments. Hair raised on skin when the track hits just right. The motion of fluids creeping up our spine as an old knowing plants itself newly in our focus. The tears that spring to blur our vision as we witness the dancer's outpouring of sentiment and story. We don't just have bodies, we are bodies. And yet, it is infinitely difficult to grasp. Indeed, to capture and enclose what it is that bodies do and how exactly bodies make meaning. How do bodies function beyond the realm of the symbolic, the metaphoric, and why might it be important to understand their materiality, their capacity for making things happen, moving the world around them? We have seen, especially and uniquely so from a Rican standpoint, the violence of the logocentric structuring of thought and the social worlds it engenders. Simply put, we understand the hierarchical and violent relationship of the discursive to the enfleshed. But we also understand that in the illegibility of the enfleshed, there are also deep potentialities. We know that the sensate, that ever powerful place of the erotic, can be a pathway to a knowing otherwise, an otherwise place of liberation, even if it also forces us deep into the crevices of the many wounds that mark that same flesh. It is the belief in this knowing that brings us into gathering today, in the hopes of building something, building on something. To echo the exclamation of an exasperated parent, willing the successful passing of ancestral wisdoms, we know better. How can bodies bring us into this knowing better, and how can we be better in our knowing about bodies? Finally, how is this knowing better about and through bodies fundamental to the collective work of creating the Rican futures we need and deserve? What I share with you today is based in part on my experience as a student and practitioner of bomba dance and later drums for the last 2 decades, and the relation, reflection, and research that has emerged in the process. It has been a journey of increasingly layered understanding of bomba as a practice whose power exceeds the cathartic, expressive, agential qualities that are most immediately perceived. I have come to understand it as the site of counter histories, replete with what Sara Bruno calls an embodied affective archive that tracks not just a counter memory, but performatively instantiates again and again and again a counter humanity in the here and now. There are many embodied practices that have literally cultivated this terrain: foodways, navigation of waterways, healing, planting, crafting, orature. But dance, what I think of as dancing, in its refusal to adhere to capitalist ideas of production, time, and labor, uniquely routes us to this site. Spanish cronistas repeatedly referenced dancing both because it was a central presence in the indigenous societies they sought to conquer and because they could not make sense of it. These writings reflect both awe and a desire to penetrate, indeed to capture, an embodied meaning-making attached to a cosmology and worldview for which they had no framework or referent. One cronista writes that, quote, "They love to dance, but they are more agile than we are, first, because nothing pleases them better than dancing, and secondly, because they are naked and untrammeled by clothing." According to accounts in his journals, Columbus interpreted his first encounter with Taino dance aboard his ship La Niña in 1492 as evidence that these were easily excitable and thus manipulatable people. And though these writings precede the arrival of enslaved Africans to the archipelagos, the naturalist Oviedo describes the Taínos aretos via reference for Black sound. Suena como los tambores sordos que hacen los negros. Furthermore, his use of the term bailar cantado to describe aretos reflects his perception of the simultaneous and inextricable co-production of sounding and movement. As the oldest extant form of drum, dance, and songmaking from Puerto Rico, developed and sustained in dynamic relation through the expressions and knowledges of enslaved Africans, their surrounding fugitive communities, and across generations of their descendants, bomba is encoded with a range of functions and innumerable stories and bodies. It is activated as a channel to the spiritual, the social, to memory and storytelling, to citational humor and play, and to the bending of time and space that comes when, through the guidance of a particularly powerful singer, dancer, or drummer, a collective integrates itself to elevate and ascend out and beyond, or perhaps to spiral in and through. As a collectively produced experience, bomba, a word thought to be of Kikongo origin, names the event, the form itself, and at the center, the drum as the ancestor and messenger, both as a measure of the Africanist aesthetics of polysignification that define it, as well as how it has been maintained and developed through fugitive longings. Bomba enables a thinking that is rich in analogy. It elides the literal, the what you see is what you get, often attached to drummed dancing, and like a code-switching tongue, shifts the terms of engagement. As such, in its capaciousness, it reflects and responds to the attitudes and norms of its time and place. The bodies that enter, exhaustion and ecstasy, the fear, the worries and the hurt, the elation and the coquetry, the jealousy and the judgment, the ego soothed, the confidence built, the freedom sought. The codes and protocols of Bomba ask us to sit uncomfortably but productively in the mire produced by living in a culture conditioned both by anti-Blackness and Black cultural knowledge. I hope you are familiar with some of the many movement building projects related to Bomba practice. Hit me up later for more specifics. From living rooms to global stages and screens, from documenting oral histories to looking to Bomba's improvisational aesthetics in order to situate it as a form of experimental dance that allows Puerto Rican artists to habitar lo imposible, which is the title of a new book on dance and experimentation in Puerto Rico. From the radical feminist interventions of La Barrilera del 8M to songs written in honor of George Floyd, who used to carry the artist's bomba drums late night after her gigs. Or the Lugares Históricos project that brings public awareness to Black histories of placemaking at the homes and locales where bomba was cultivated. Or the most recent performance installation in Humacao to honor the lives of the captive Africans, mostly children, who came to Puerto Rico in 1859 aboard the Majesty, the last slaver ship to arrive in Puerto Rico. Bomba is unlocking Puerto Rican history and rupturing the frameworks we have been given to understand it. In all these examples, we perceive how Bomba and other practices such as perreo are anti-colonial, combative, liberatory, agential, empowering, healing, and yes, resistive. But if we don't attend to the embodiments themselves, we run the risk of missing what it is that enables them to be in service of these outcomes. If we only look to the pleasure experienced in the execution or the power of the dancer having her moves marked by the drum, we miss the fact that to access the freedom making, she must also listen, that there must be spaces of stillness, of silence that is an opening, an invitation, a waiting to see what comes next, of me making space for you. We might not understand how the politics of being seen are different than the politics of being heard, but that they are deeply intertwined. Whether through the bass of the barril de bomba or el boom que llama el perreo, we perceive how the corporeal necessitates the sonic, and the sonic seeks the surfaces of our skins and the hollows of our insides. In the affirmative declaration of yo perreo sola, we might mistakenly prioritize the logics of liberal individualism over the entanglements and attachments that our survival necessitates and that the dancing rehearses. It is in the practice itself that we learn to differently organize ourselves and relate. The dancing as praxis that teaches us how we need each other. In Verano 2019, we saw how years of tireless activism and organizing paved the way for the mass protests, for the masses to join in protest. But we also saw how centuries of embodied praxis were readily available to be put into service of the collective demand. Puerto Rico is a place defined as much by its accented speech as by its distinctive corporealities. In conclusion, if we call upon the resistive capacities of these practices without accounting for embodied specificities, we are less able to attend to the ways that they can also be taken up in service of neoliberal projects of inclusion, by nationalist discourses of cultura, and how they might be vulnerable to market logics of celebration and extraction. We are less adept at understanding the epistemological necessity of Black vernaculars beyond their ability to index the past. And as a final offering, movement is generative, but it can also be violent, sending us to the ends of the earth, splintering people in place, a distraction that can lead to extraction, just as Fanon, who was very suspicious of dance. There is also power in the yo no me quito rootedness that refuses displacement. And at the same time, there is the exhaustion that comes with the muscled holding of resilience. A veces simplemente hay que moverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jade. That was really beautiful. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Shakti Castro. Shakti is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Columbia University. She holds a BA from Hunter College and an MA from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her dissertation, Agenda of Survival, Puerto Ricans, Public Health, and the Politics of Harm Reduction, 1970 to 2000, focuses on illicit drug use, the development of syringe exchange programs, and AIDS activism within Puerto Rican communities in New York City and the archipelago. Thank you, Shakti. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks so much, Marisol. I was really excited to learn that the symposium's theme this year would be Rican bodies, and that in particular, this plenary panel would think about movement and movement building. And so, like Jade, I also grabbed onto some very literal interpretations, that theme. I am a historian, but I use a variety of interdisciplinary methods, including material culture, geography, and borrowing some methods from sociologists around sociospatial stigma. And to that end, I want to share a bit of history about Puerto Rican harm reduction in New York and within the archipelago. And to define harm reduction, it is a set of practical tools to help people prevent harms of drug use. So transmission of HIV and hepatitis C, overdose death, wound issues, all sorts of things. And so, the city's more formal history with harm reduction bounces back and forth between legal and illegal, what is sanctioned and funded versus more guerrilla tactics to ensure the safety and well-being of drug users. And for Puerto Rican IV drug users, harm reduction is and has been not only a life-saving tool, but a radical assertion of bodily autonomy that fits into a much longer history of health activism. And this health activism, I argue, and many others would as well, is an important part of the history of our anti-colonial protests. And I'm gonna share my screen. I'd like to show you all some images while I continue speaking. So I work with an organization called Bronx Mobile, which is a Bronx-based and Boricua-founded street harm reduction group. And we do street outreach on weekends with primarily Spanish-speaking IV drug users, many Latinx, and the vast majority Puerto Rican. From research conducted by Camila Gelpi Acosta and Miguel Cano, we know that here in the US, people of Puerto Rican heritage die of drug overdoses at much higher rates than other Hispanic groups or non-Hispanic whites. Gelpi Acosta and Cano go on to elaborate that this has much to do with drug use knowledge and relationships to drug use culture that Puerto Rican migrants bring with them from Puerto Rico to New York. The island's harm reduction network is lacking, and while there are more resources here in New York City, there are just as many obstacles to access those resources. The people we work with, we call them participants, they navigate a landscape of human services agencies, municipal and nonprofit, as well as the criminal justice and healthcare systems. So I would like to share an image that was created in collaboration between Bronx Mobile and Arts Everywhere. This is a map adapted from the GIS mapping that we do during street outreach, but it is deliberately obscured to protect the people that we work with. The stops here could be engagements with participants, loading up on supplies, stopping to learn more about an encampment. There's any number of ways that we interact with people on the street. And in the course of doing that, we understand that they themselves, Puerto Rican IV drug users, are enacting their own strategies of care and solidarity. They use and create objects in ways that assist and encourage other people who use drugs, creating community in encampments and finding ways to make inhospitable urban spaces safer. And I'd like to show you two images. On the left is a container of antifreeze for a car. This is in a location that is known as a drug sale spot. We visit this space pretty frequently. And someone, either a harm reduction worker from an agency or someone who buys, uses in this area, created this makeshift sharps container. And we see this a lot in the places that we go, glass bottles, containers, so that there is a place to dispose of used syringes. On the right is a photograph I took on outreach. You'll often see that the people that we work with will take any extra supplies they have and make them available in the street to other folks in need of them. And so we see through this that our participants are working to clean up where they are, minimize syringe litter and risk to other community members. When we think about these efforts in comparison to New York's Department of Health and some of the efforts they have made, some with participant input, we can see that there's a long way to go. And, this leads me to ask questions about how can we imagine a city planned with harm reduction as a foundation, one that, accommodates people's needs and also how they use space around them. Thinking about bodily autonomy and political sovereignty, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of needle exchange in New York City. In a 1989 New York Times article, Hilton Clark, member of the Black and Hispanic Caucus of the New York City Council, denounced plans for a pilot needle exchange program run by the city's Department of Health. Clark, along with others on the council, claimed that the program was inhumane, criminal, and racist. In other statements, Clark and Enoch Williams, also a member of the council, likened the program to genocide. In response, Yolanda Serrano, the founder and director of ADAPT, the Association for Drug Abuse Prevention and Treatment, fired back. The opponents of this program call it genocide. Well, genocide is what is happening now. People are dying in our parks, in our hospitals, on our streets. Serrano, a Puerto Rico-born, Brooklyn-raised drug and HIV counselor, was one of a handful of folks in New York pushing for the health department to adopt evidence-based practices. With ADAPT, she would head into shooting galleries, places where people were using. She would hand out bleach, wound care items, and hygiene information. In 1987, Serrano and ADAPT, in a protest against the city's inaction on moving forward with a needle exchange program, threatened to hand out sterile syringes in El Barrio. She was often referred to as the Avon Lady of AIDS prevention, and she was instrumental in getting the 1989 pilot up and running. She would drive to Brooklyn in her own car, pick up IV drug users, and ferry them back to the pilot. And so this pilot was hindered from the start based on its location near One Police Plaza, near the courts. The image on the left is Yolanda Serrano herself. The image on the right is a protest undertaken by ADAPT in support of the needle exchange. David Dinkins, under political pressure from the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS, shut down the pilot later in the year. And while it did reopen, it was not without controversy. In much the same way that Clark and Williams referred to needle exchange as genocide, we see similar sentiment from pretty radical groups, even in the 1970s. The Lincoln Detox is one such group. Some people venerate them as a sort of proto-harm reduction. And in a way, they were doing work that was monumental, amazing, unseen before. But it was also anti-methadone. and it also understood methadone treatment to be a form of genocide. These protests and demonstrations for better harm reduction infrastructure, AIDS treatment, and safe sex education were prevalent in Puerto Rico as well, especially in 1990, where during a series of island-based conferences attended by AIDS organizations and government officials, Puerto Rican and Latinx members of ACT UP staged die-ins and protests against Governor Hernandez Colon on his inaction in the crisis. We know from Renee Esparesa's work, looking at this series of protests, that for Puerto Ricans and other Latinos in ACT UP, their experiences as part of diasporic and migrant communities and as people of the global South were inextricably linked to their identities as queer and drug-using folks living with HIV and AIDS. In the 1990 protests, Puerto Rican activists explicitly linked their protests within the larger disaster of colonialism and dependence on the United States. Puerto Rican activists as part of the ACT UP coalition in Puerto Rico and those working in drug addiction and treatment services in New York envisioned a radical health politic, one that's foundation was built on radical solidarity and bodily autonomy. Even as these visions often clashed with political representatives of their communities and those who considered themselves as scholars and workers of liberation as well. Serrano's work and that of Joyce Rivera and so many others paved the way for On Point, the nation's first legally recognized and sanctioned overdose prevention center in El Barrio in Washington Heights. The overdose prevention centers have been subject to much community criticism, even as they have reversed over 1,000 would-be fatal overdoses since they opened in 2021. When one visits On Point, you are greeted with a wall proclaiming, "Este sitio salva vidas." This place saves lives. In the back of the El Barrio location is a beautiful garden, a raised deck. Inside an acupuncture room where Black and Latinx harm reductionists give participants a brief history of the Lincoln detox, using holistic and alternative health approaches, including acupuncture, to treat substance use problems within the community. On Point is run by Sam Rivera, a Puerto Rican from the LES who identifies as Afro-Taino, and the site offers wraparound services to those with problematic substance use, including medical care, caseworker assistance, and connections to housing. The charge of genocide from other Black and Latinx organizers within the area remains, echoing responses to needle exchange to methadone treatment before it. But Puerto Rican organizers like Black harm reductionists use the tools of harm reduction to address not only the harms of drugs, but those of the drug war, white supremacy, colonialism, and class warfare. I argue that the Puerto Rican history of harm reduction is one where queer people of color created and moved between transgressive and subversive spaces, blended and shared identities and communities, and enacted politics of solidarity amongst groups who were outside the norms of respectability. It is through this framing of solidarity and disenfranchisement that I approach, and I invite all of you to think about the links between our history of health activism and our current crises now. We must continue to reject stigma and respectability, rejecting not only US colonialism, but Puerto Rican elites who envisioned a white Hispanophone nation by attempting to exclude our most vulnerable through coerced migration, as well as strivers within the diaspora who aspire to assimilation rather than radical coalition. I invite you all to think about harm reduction as part of our long tradition of decolonial activism for bodily autonomy, to think about a radical embrace of drug users and how it offers a template for sharing struggle with the most vulnerable within our community. If we think about the necropolitical framework for how the US treats IV drug users and how upwardly mobile members of our communities, those who resort to, quote, "we're more than just drug addicts," end quote, as a way to other themselves from these vulnerable, we see the links between the vision of building the nation by excluding our poor, Black and brown, women, removing their autonomy to make way for a modernized Puerto Rico. And we can also see how those invested in remaking the, quote, ghetto partner with organizations and businesses that encourage and promote gentrification of places like the South Bronx, East Harlem, Bushwick, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakti. That was really, really fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Melissa Rosario. Melissa is a queer, non-binary Nuyorican who rematriated to Puerto Rico in 2016 after completing a doctorate in anthropology and Latinx studies at Cornell University. As a cultural worker and healing justice practitioner, Melissa spends much of her time visioning, designing, and facilitating intentional spaces of connection in community with other QT BIPOC Boricuas and close allies. They also have been working on their first book, Beyond Disaster, Building Collective Futures in Borique, which will soon be in press at Northwestern University. Overall, Melissa's work in this lifetime is to alchemize historical wounds into medicine as they walk a path towards decolonization alongside other queer kin, organizers, artists, and Indigenous elders. Melissa is the founder and co-director of the Center for Embodied Pedagogy and Action, also known as CEPA, whose mission is to promote the decolonization of Puerto Rico through a diverse array of tactics, all centering community care, somatic practice, and ancestral reclamation. All of Melissa's work is grounded in practice of aligning their values and their actions. They are a firm believer in the mind-body-spirit connection and in the force of creative expression to transform. So Melissa, we're so happy to have you here today. Go for it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my co-panelists for the amazing work that you shared with us. I could already see some really interesting points of connection. And thank you to the PRSA organizers for the invitation to be with you all today. And thank you to the people who showed up to listen and dialogue with us. So I'm joining you all from Puerto Rico, the original Rican body. So I wanted to first begin by calling in and acknowledging Atabe, the spirit of this land. So I give thanks for the opportunity to work for collective liberation here on the land of my ancestors, home of so much power that goes unnoticed to the untrained eye. I open to this other vision of you, Borique, held by ocean, fed by subterranean rivers. Even in this heat, we connect to your waters. We have been conditioned to thinking of you as small, but I know that you are an archipelago full of magic and impossible diversity. I uplift the genius of a people under attack, thought to have died, but somehow have survived, hidden in plain sight, in Jiwaro traditions and practices, in our language words like chorete, barbacoa, hamaca. You have stayed with us. I offer my open heart to collaborate, uplift, and support those who have long stewarded this land and continue to practice our traditions, be that under the name Jíbaro, Taíno, or Afro-Indígena. Our repatriation in any form as displaced peoples offers grounding and peace that can feed the work of building the relations needed to ensure the growth and flourishing of our movements towards liberation. So I've thought a lot about movement building over the last, 20 years, and I've come to believe that embodiment is the key to radical transformation. Embodiment is what is habitual in us. It's how we show up, the shape we're most comfortable in. But embodiment with a degree of intentionality can also be the process of becoming more aware of and practiced in behaviors that align vision and action. My own story is the emergence point for this understanding. I'm third generation New Yorican who had very little connection to the archipelago as a child. And it was only through academic study and research and one of my homes, which was PRSA, that I began to imagine the possibility of returning. Up until that point, I really lived more reality akin to what Chloe Georas calls native of nowhere. When I finished my PhD and I saw that I wasn't receiving job offers that honored me, I decided to take the leap and move to Puerto Rico to try to do some version of the work I had done / witnessed as a researcher. I wanted to not only talk about liberation, I wanted to practice it. And I had no real idea how to do that. I had witnessed the 2010 strikes at the University of Puerto Rico and endless battles to protect the coastline from privatization. I had witnessed the euphoria of winning and the grief over failed relationships, internal violence, and the way we unintentionally embody the values of a system that's designed to kill us. And even our thriving is dependent on our ability to kind of embody those things which are not going to help us get free. And I think that's really what movements are all about. Feeling on a deep level and knowing that something's wrong, heeding that feeling, and then experimenting with ways to change it. Yes, there's strategy. Yes, there's planning. But some of the most important and transformative work, in my experience, comes from a willingness to move towards the unknown, a willingness to move towards questions like, how can we become the people we need for each other, for the next world? How do we restore our connections to one another, to the land, to our more than human kin? And then we begin that work of filling in the gaps and aligning with a vision. Rematriating for me was the start of a lifelong journey to embody decolonization. And, I had examined and been really inspired by a lot of the work on decolonial theory. And yet there's another piece, there's a complexity that happens when we're really trying to not only talk about something, but practice it. And rematriation, one of the ways I like to think about it, comes from Yasmin Hernandez, who's another fellow New Yorican who returned to Puerto Rico. And she says it's returning to the womb. And, certainly as a movement led by Indigenous women, anytime we return things to their origin and to the people who stewarded them, we restore connections, we restore trust, we restore an order. And when I'm talking about order, I'm talking about something more like spiritual order. We could talk more about that, but I just wanted to kind of touch on it. And then in the spirals of my own life and my own interests, I was invited to create a curriculum about decolonizing for organizers, and shout out to Bao, who is one of the interpreters today, and did the presentation, and they are one of the co-authors. And even in that walk then, I met some folks who were doing ceremony with Indigenous elders in Jayuya, and then I started to join in with them and to deepen in my relationship with this question of how do we steward and how do we reconnect with the traditions and the cultures which were taken from us and which colonizers and elite tried to make us believe were erased. The organization that I founded in that practice and that return and currently co-lead is SEPA is really the place where I'm continuing to contribute to movement building from a more quiet or slow work of healing. This doesn't always feel so quiet when you're in those crises, but it's not what we normally think of when we're first thinking about movement. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that they're interpreters and switch to Spanish. Y el trabajo de SEPA centra en la descolonización ampliamente, ¿verdad? Estamos siempre tratando de crear espacios que nos permiten vivir la vida como algo sagrado, como si todos los días fueran ceremonias. Desde un programa de dialectos de decolonización que unió personas en diferentes áreas en la diáspora con 2 grupos en Puerto Rico, el portal de práctica, que es un espacio diario corto de práctica que llevamos haciendo desde agosto. Hemos comprobado que la sanación colectiva es sumamente política y que el trabajo que hacemos se basa en la idea que todo lo que deseamos cambiar en el mundo también vive en nuestro cuerpo. Y si no liberamos desde la cuerpa, nunca estaremos libres. Pueden cambiar las condiciones, como hemos visto en muchos lugares en el mundo, pero siguen reproduciendo la misma dinámica, ¿verdad? Con diferentes caras liderando. Y podemos ver el impacto de la historia en el presente a nivel individual y colectivo, en nuestras relaciones, en las rupturas y la violencia. Y para nosotros es imposible hablar de la descolonización de un país sin hablar de un proceso personal de repensar nuestro condicionamiento y qué valoramos, cómo aprendemos, etcétera. Y entonces estamos en esta búsqueda siempre de recuperar nuestra memoria antigua a través de la relación que tenemos con la planta y con ese, como lo puso Jade, lo mencionó, como ese silencio, esa quietud, que también es parte de lo que se define la medicina de la bomba. También para nosotros es eso, como que volver al origen también es volver a ese quietud, ese yo soy, ese de acá en mí, que no depende de otros, pero es mi esencia. Y nada, estamos tejiendo identidades diversas, centramos personas queer, que puedo hablar de eso más en una forma más profunda luego, pero para nosotros es esa ruptura de la binaria, ¿verdad? De lo que estructura la sociedad y lo que pensamos que es bueno y malo, que queremos soltar, y elevar también la sabiduría de las personas, mujeres cis, personas trans, personas fem, personas no binarias, que inclusive en los movimientos de reclamación indígena aún se ve un trabajo de descolonizar a recorrer, pero estamos todos en desconstrucción y creo que a la medida que podemos ofrendar esa compasión y honestidad, podemos lograr cosas grandes, cosas distintas, y es eso lo que estamos buscando. In conclusion, I guess, healing our relationships and embodying our dreams is not only possible, it is vital to building movements that are as deep as they are expansive, that are joyful as well as militant. The body is how we get free, how we feel in it, tells us how far we've made it. Así que, gracias.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was amazing. Thank you. So last but certainly not least, it is my pleasure to introduce Arnaldo Cruz-Malavé. And let me see if, so you could start your video, Arnaldo. There we go. All right, awesome. So Arnaldo is a professor of Spanish, comparative literature, and Latin American and Latinx studies at Fordham University. He is the author of Queer Latino Testimonio, Keith Haring and Juanito Extravaganza, Hard Tales, a book about the relationship between art and Latinx popular culture and gentrifying New York of the 1980s. He's also the author of El Primitivo Implorante, a study of the intersections of nationalism and queer sexuality in the prose fiction of the Cuban author José Lezama Lima. He is editor of the anthology of short stories, Cuentos Casi Completos de Manuel Ramos Otero, and co-editor, along with Martin Mann and Lanson, excuse me, of Queer Globalization, Citizenship and the Afterlife of Colonialism. His most recent publications are Bailando en un Encierro, Duelo, Danza y Activismo en las manifestaciones, del verano boricua de 2019, from our good friends at Editora Emergente, and an annotated edition of Cuentos Completos de Manuel Ramos Otero, published by the Institute for Puerto Rican Culture and Callejon. He has been the recipient of the NEH and Ford Foundation Fellowships, visiting professor at Harvard, and a former member of the board of directors for the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies of CUNY's Graduate Center and Fordham University Press. So Arnaldo, please take it away.
Thank you, Marisol. Thank you, and thanks to the executive committee for inviting me and for the opportunity to be in conversation, in dialogue with people that I admire, Jade, Shakti, and Melissa. For my comments on what we are calling the Rican body, I would like to share with you some reflections on my latest piece, the one that you just mentioned, Dancing in an Enclosure, Activism and Mourning in the Demonstrations of the Puerto Rican Summer of 2019. The piece comes out of my experience participating in the demonstrations of the summer of 2019, what we know as the Boricua Summer, or as Urayoan Noel has proposed, el Soberano, suggesting a new form of sovereignty, perhaps the more radical queer sovereignty of which Juana Maria Rodriguez speaks. In one of the demonstrations in which I participated, we were invited or called to rally at the western entrance to Central Park by the monument to of all things, by the monument to the USS Maine. As we know, the ship whose explosion in Havana Harbor triggered the Spanish-American War and the subsequent occupation of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and ended up, to my surprise, after marching through Times Square in the main concourse of Grand Central Station during the rush hours as commuters hurried to their gates. There we broke into a salsa-inflected line dance, which interrupted the predetermined and synchronized routes of the destination-bound commuters and substituted them with the multi-directional paths that our swaying and sashaying steps traced while we cried out affirmatively in call and response, yo soy boricua pa que tú lo sepas, yo soy boricua para que tú lo sepas, in case algún despistado had not seen the cues. Time seemed then to enlarge, to become inexhaustible like a rabbit eternally flowing out of a magician's hat, I would write. And it was as if something had not only interrupted, but walked in, not only erupted, but erupted, irrumpido, thrusting us into another economy and another place, like the event of which Alain Badiou speaks, which was not only not foreseen, but could not be inscribed in the current system of knowledge, and seemed thus not weighed down, not tainted by reactive resentment, and offered us itself up as something on the order of joy, or at least perhaps, as the cultural critics Frances Negro Montaner and Yolanda Martinez San Miguel and the performer Gisela Rosario Ramos have called it Hayaera, or decolonial joy. Reading and meditating about this joy and speaking to performers and activists like the voguing performance educator MC at the Renuncia Ball, which was held at the Plaza de Armas during the demonstrations, Edrimael Delgado, visual and performance artist Aldrin Manuel Cañas, who also performed at the Renuncia Ball, And the educator and bailadora de bomba, Clara Isabel Diaz, who performed at the Union Square Park rally in New York, I came to understand this joy as a performative politics of the body, one that in the midst of destitution and want defiantly asserted, like that old Puerto Rican saying, que nos quiten lo bailado. Let them try, que se atrevan, to take away that which we've already danced or enjoyed. They can't, because like the creative force, life force that Audre Lorde has called the erotic, this joyous affirmation of the body's vitally creative power could not be reified or expropriated. It was not, in its singular ephemerality, una categoría expropiable. Watching and analyzing the expressions of this corporal performative politics of Hayaera and joy, I also came to understand its complex, intricate relationship with mourning, its active denunciation of the neoliberal necropolitical austerity policies of the Puerto Rican colonial government that created the conditions that made possible the rise in feminicides, murderous transphobia, and violence against LGBTQ and racialized people. In the demonstrations of the summer of 2019, the signs of this mourning were everywhere, not only on the black and white Puerto Rican flag or on the figure of 4645 that some people carried on their bodies painted on their very flesh, but also on the fanciful, old-fashioned widows' mourning veils that voguers had done for their daring, death-defying spins down the runway. The long black shawl that the bailadora de bomba, Clara Isabel Diaz, wielded like a weapon, demanding that the primo speak and tell Rosario que mi patria tiene bandera. And yet, though these signs were evidently funerary, most of them never veered from the centrality and primacy of the joyful body, never sought to impose a homogeneous solemn unity of affect, or called for the duelo común, or unity in grief, in which, following Ernst Renan's famous dictum, shared grief rather than joy is the foundation of national identity. Puerto Rican nationalism had always aspired since the 19th century. On the contrary, the protests expanded that gap between gestures and intentions, gestures and their affects, that Edgardo Rodriguez Julia, bemoaning its disturbing presence in the middle of grief, called the extravío, wandering, straying, extravagance, loss, even madness, that had traditionally rendered impossible, according to him, the achievement of a homogeneous and unified national identity and culture. With the performances of the Verano Boricua, one could argue then Puerto Rican activist cultures have not only migrated to that border, that gap or extravío between gestures and affects, but relocated there the struggles against colonialism, racism, and patriarchy, turning the border thus into a site that is generative not only of interruptions, but of relationalities and world-making reimaginings. What is then most stunning to me about the complex interaction and interdependency between mourning and joy in the demonstrations of the Verano Boricua is that after having broken through irrumpido, Antigone-like, the prohibitions against mourning from the government and the self, after having punctured or shattered, that is, as I propose, the mask of melancholia that was imposed by the state's call to resiliency, and the shield of melancholia people had to don to protect themselves from trauma, these performances chose to use the immense force produced from this breakthrough not to suture the gap between gestures and affects, not to propose a new duelo común that would heal and harmonize the nation, but to reimagine syncopatedly in call and response a new world. More than the effective ouster of Rosario, it is this that, to my mind, is most hopeful and most radical about the performances of the demonstrations of El Soberano del 2019. This migration of the demonstrations performances to the gap between gestures and affect resonates with other contemporary conceptions of activism. It aligns with Derrida's notion of mourning as an always incomplete process whose constant oscillation between melancholia and mourning, incorporation and introjection, produces a borderline condition that functions on grieving subjects as an infinite demand or a driving force. And it accords with Saidiya Hartman's conception of an activism that is not, in her words, about reparations, but about redress, not about attempting to retrieve the past or the phantom of the dead, but about stepping into that undecipherable cryptic, no place of loss, that is death, to expand the limits of life through what Hartman calls liberating the performative. And it is certainly in dialogue with Jose Muñoz and Juana Maria Rodriguez's deployment of Giorgio Agamben's notion of gesture as a means without end that offers a critique by interrupting a politics of conventionally prescribed ends and opens up instead a field of potential utopian gestures that they identify with what Muñoz has beautifully termed the ephemeral, the not vanishing point effect of queer dance. And it also confirms what Jose Atiles Osoria has called the shift or turn toward the orillas as a turn in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican culture, during the demonstrations, toward the orillas as a site of reencuentros and profanaciones beyond the exceptionality of the juridical framework of colonial law. Perhaps then, there is no more emblematic and compelling activist performance in the demonstrations than the Perreo Combativo. But not only because it was the most scandalous or responded to the church's homophobic policies, but because immersing themselves in the most liminal of grounds between the cathedral and fortaleza, the spiritual and the temporal, the church and the state, that no man's land, that zero ground where we could suggest the community drowned El Hijo de Trinidad, that the demonstrators managed not only to interrupt the given common sense, but to incite us as well with their stomping and bumping and twerking and grinding to reimagine a different world and propel ourselves toward a different future. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaldo. And I'd love to invite the rest of the panelists to turn the cameras on and rejoin us. Again, for those of you, in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any questions to the panel as a whole or to individual panelists. We'll be reading through these questions later in the conversation. I just want to begin by thanking you all for just such really evocative and I think really beautiful and powerful remarks. I thought there was going to be a lot of intersections between the panelists, and I was right. And it was really amazing to kind of hear the ways so many of the comments that you were making really touched on points that the other panelists were also kind of interrogating in their own work. So thank you. And I'm really excited for us to kind of have a conversation and think together around some of these questions. I have like 4 pages of notes or something, so I'm going to try and make this coherent. So bear with me. But I think the first question I wanted to ask was actually, I think something that, you all touched on, but, Arnaldo is something you said towards the end of your remarks, but thinking about bodies as something that interrupts temporality in a lot of ways, right? And I think this is something that you all kind of touched on, were these questions about how bodies actually open up alternative histories, right? And can serve as vehicles to connecting us to ancestral past, all of these things. Melissa, I saw a lot of parallels with that in what you were discussing as well, right? In thinking about the way, the body knows, right? And the body as almost like a portal, right? To thinking about other temporalities in the past in particular, but to imagine a new future, right? And so I just want to invite you all to kind of, I think just, I think you all touched on it, but to expand on this idea of how can we think about the relationship between bodies and temporality.
Well, I was also struck by that, and I remember key words in the other presentations. Jade's presentation was very striking to me, and I think that the word that comes to mind was specificity. I mean, that she seemed to be talking about not jumping into these kinds of practices and thinking that immediately that they are going to connect you, that it's all going to be free and joy, that those practices will not be cannot be assimilated by the market. And I think both Melissa and Shakti also touched on, I think, well, Melissa definitely touched on the issue of practice. She says, well, it gets a little bit more difficult, yeah. So again, to me, there's something that has to do with specificity, with, and in my case, and with interruption, that in my case, it has to do with undecipherability, and I definitely think of bomba as that. Bomba to me, and I perdona, Jade, if I make a, because you are the expert, and I'm not a practitioner, but to me, what I feel when I see bomba is someone hitting a wall, going against that, and there is a space for, of what you called as well, silence, undecipherable. Of course, Saidiya Harman calls it, it's what you cannot retrieve, not because you don't want to. You want to, of course, you can't retrieve it. You can't recuperate it, So, and of course, it's also a space. In the case of the demonstrations, it was definitely the space of that you cannot transgress. That is, they are next to you, but you cannot transgress, which is, and completely understand, which is the space of mourning and the space of death, right? At any rate, I think I view that as something, I would imagine that as a dancer, as a practitioner, you view that as something that incites you to greater discipline, to greater, something that challenges you. But I view it as definitely something that it is what opens the way to imagining differently. What Shakti talked about, a different thinking, I believe, thinking differently. So I see, it is both a space that can be seen as negative and unyielding, but it's also a space that can open, and it can function to open up a panoply, if you will, of possibilities to reimagining.
I will respond just a little bit there. Tanta cosa. So I think that, you know, to address the question of temporality, and, you know, I really think of it as a routing towards something, right? And it's not necessarily toward a past or toward a future, it's toward a something else, right? And this is very Muñozian, right? This is very on the, you know, on the horizon, but that we know that this doesn't work, right? And that it is killing us. And to be able to inhabit, right, with our actual time that we are here now, to be able to inhabit and lock in. And this is where the relational component is so important, right? Is that it actually, you start to thread yourself in with others, right? And that together it's like, es como el río, you know, it is. And you know, and the sonic is, it takes us, it moves, they're waves, right? They actually travel. And so it can create a parallel universe, you know, para decirlo así. And it's a parallel temporality, right? I mean, it is, but it's also, you know, in performance theory, there's the one of the sacred cows of performance theory is this idea of repetition, right? That performance is the repeating of actions. But there's also ways of thinking about it that is like an ongoingness, right? And so I think of it, you know, like the scream, you know, or el llanto, or whatever it's ongoingness, and we can these are technologies for allowing us to plug into that ongoingness that has been happening and continues to happen. But that, you know, it's not just so we can consider it an escape, but I guess what I'm trying to say about the specificity is in the learning, the technical aspects of getting there, right? That, that we also learn how to organize ourselves. We also learn that, you know, a veces te tienes que callar la boca. We also learn that if you're too scared to do something, you're not holding up your end of the deal. That our own insecurities get in our ways, right? We learn our responsibilities to each other, and there are a lot of ways that this happens, right? There are a lot of ways that this happens. I'm just using this particular example because I think that it models that for us. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that it's, you're absolutely right. It's impenetrable. It's difficult for us to assess, to make it legible, and that's part of its power too. But we, in attending to specificity, we can actually understand how to get there with the rest of everybody that's doing it.
Yeah. I think about two things when I think about bodies interrupting temporality. I think first about linear time not being like the be all end all of time, that there are other ways of organizing time that are older, more for example, in ceremony, they say we're always in the eternal present. So there's this kind of way of here in my body right now, I can interrupt the temporality of linear time through my healing, because whatever is happening here in this moment has this kind of effect on all of time. It doesn't erase things, but it could eliminate a charge in me that is keeping me small or sick or somehow lost. And I think that bodies also, like when I think about interrupting temporality too, I think about how, when we think about linear time, there's a way in which society is structured where we are forced to, in order to thrive, we have to do well at the things that are making us sick. So we live in scarcity. In academia, there's all of the like the publish or perish. There's that kind of like the activity, we're always accelerated. There's always things that are happening. There's always the next thing. Am I doing enough? Am I sufficient? And the body can be a way to really interrupt that if we refuse to engage in time in that kind of way. Let me think, is there anything else? And that's the way that the body is a portal to me. You know, because when we talk about how our traumas, the things that people are not able to heal in our lineage before us are passed on to us, and we may not understand them and we'll never have access to the thing that makes me anxious, which could have been a thing that happened 3 generations ago that maybe bisabuela, like my great grandmother, she could have never moved through that. But if each generation can't move it, then it kind of comes with us. And so when we do work to heal collectively, we can also find a way to rupture that knot or that thing that kind of keeps us stuck in that other moment. And I don't think we always, it doesn't even have to be conscious. Like that's the thing about healing work that's somatic that I find really interesting, because it's not about being able to reclaim that story and narrate it. Like I could say step by step what happened, but I can notice something happening for me and I could find a way to shift on a microscopic level. And that allows more spaciousness in my body and then allows for other choices to be made. Yeah. And I really love that image that you gave, Jade, about threading yourself with others, and that you're in this river. This like time as a river is another kind of really powerful way to think about things. Yeah. That's all I can think of for right now. Thanks for the question.
Shakti, do you want to say anything? No. Well, I just really quickly want to, I do have a question, Shakti. My next question is like based off stuff that you said. So, but, you know, I think it's also, just before I ask that, you know, sticking with this temporality question for a second too, one of the things really interesting that keeps coming up in the comments also is this notion of slowness too, and like stillness, and you know, how do we think about that in terms of movement building, right? And so there's a sense in which, particularly if we think about the kind of prolonged and dire crisis, right, that Puerto Ricans, both in the archipelago and the diaspora, find themselves in, have found themselves in, right? There's such a sense of urgency of life and death, right, that sometimes it feels really hard. And, you know, thinking, Shakti, also of your work, right, literally these matters of life and death, that it can feel really hard to slow down. It can feel really hard to take a breath. It can feel really hard to be still and silent, right? And so the ways in which these kind of crises stemming from, you know, racism, capitalism, colonialism, right? They you know, thinking about Sandra Ruiz's work, right? They create a colonial clock, right? Where everything is sped up, everything is urgent, everything is life and death, right? And so the ways in which, you know, I think, Melissa, your last comments, right, around this notion of slowness also help us to think about, like, what are the ways in which that's something that has to be balanced, right? Is the kind of need for stillness and introspection and connection, right, that only comes through those moments, right, with the kind of urgency that's created by these crises, right? So I don't necessarily have a question about that, but I do think it's something that's come up in both the kind of question and answer portion, but also in your discussions, that is really interesting. How do we kind of like balance that, right? These kind of exigencies and urgencies on the one hand, and the need that movement building actually does take for space and time and embodiment and connection, right? That is a completely different speed, right? So we don't have to address that. If anybody does, we can, but
I mean, that is the question, or that is the tension, the perpetual tension, I think. But I have an elder who said to me, slow down, we don't have much time, which is a way of like kind of flipping the script on the urgency of, if we don't have a lot of time, then how do we punctuate the movement with the pauses that allow for regeneration and for us to move with a more intentional kind of and less reactionary kind of speed. But there are things we have to respond to. I mean, it's impossible to ignore. So, yeah.
So I wanted to, you know, one of the other things that kind of threaded through, I felt like your kind of remarks, and I think your work as a whole for all of you, right, is around you know, thinking particularly with Shakti's work, right, is you know, you said at the end the really kind of provocative you know, statement for us to think about harm reduction as like key, right, to anti-colonial strategy, right? And thinking about harm reduction in, I think, the kind of ample way that you are encouraging and directing us to kind of you know, really consider it. And you know, there's something about, you know, thinking about it, like the thing that keeps harm reduction from being centered in anti-colonial strategizing, right, and work, is respectability politics, right? And you know, Melissa, I was thinking about what you were saying too, is like, you know, almost like the Lauren Berlant kind of approach, right? What are the ways in which we all try to fit into these things that are so bad for us, right? Because we think they're going to help us succeed, or we think that this is what it means to, you know, be Puerto Rican or to be whatever, right? These things that actually are quite limiting and harming of us, right? So I was just, you know, curious to hear a little bit more in terms of how you all are thinking about questions of respectability politics in your work, right? And thinking about the ways in which the kind of work that you're looking at, whether we're thinking about dance and performance, whether we're thinking about kind of healing, whether we're thinking about harm reduction, right? How does that help us think about ways to challenge respectability politics, right? To move beyond respectability politics towards other frameworks, right, for survival and liberation. So
That's a really great question, and obviously I have a lot of thoughts about it. I really subscribe to Kathy Cullen's wonderful work about AIDS in the Black community, and thinking about the political potential of a word like queer to think about folks, right? And how the term queer has been, you know, limited in its potential because it was supposed to transcend these heteronormative politics and you know, issue binaries, and you know, who is excluded from being considered queer, when queer and the radical potential of it, as Cohen tells us, is about coalitions of people who are pushed outside the bounds of respectability, right? And so what I find so interesting, and what so much of what I have been uncovering lately, is these tensions between Black and Puerto Rican community leaders, you know, some of whom are very aspirational, you know, upwardly mobile folks, and thinking about, well, you know, these people using drugs in the street, they're messing up our image, right? Like, we're not all drug addicts. It's like, some of us are people with substance use issues. Some of the people we love the most are people with substance use issues. And, you know, it's a very active exclusion from the vision of what the nation should be or the community should be. And, you know, I always remember I was invited to be on a panel. I will not say where and with who, But a question that came up post Maria was, well, we should enact community land trusts. That's how we can get Puerto Rico back. And I just thought to myself, what does that mean to the dude who's scraping together $5, right? Like, what does that mean to the people that I work with who are just trying to get high, just trying to find a place to stay overnight? They're sleeping on rooftops, like those visions of reclaiming Puerto Rico or reclaiming an identity are maybe not the most pressing things, and they can't be for them, right? To think more about that question of urgency and temporality. Like, these are folks who are not even thought of by even some of the most radical folks who are thinking about revolution and how we move forward. And I mean, we have to build and learn from and move with the most vulnerable people in our communities to move forward. Like, we ain't free until we're all free, right? And so, respectability is something that I challenge really deeply. I think a lot about our most important archives and, the people we're writing about. And like, what happened to the Thomsonian idea of history from the bottom, right? And so many of our archives are they're about outliers or, really unique people and thinking about all the contributions they've made. It's like everyone's making a contribution. Everyone is on this bus, right? We can't get anywhere if we're excluding these folks and folks who have so much to teach us about resiliency and survival and, navigating a hellscape of an apocalypse, right?
Also, I don't know, I think that what I described, how I felt at the demonstrations and what made an impact on me was, Jade calls it that river. I call it sort of like a door open and you are in this other space and in this other economy and things, and in this other temporality that seems inexhaustible and endless, right? That it wasn't already pre-planned as reactive, So I think that, anytime that you propose, you propose something that goes against what the politics of respectability is, you already are underestimating what that community is. You're underestimating, you already have a stereotype of what the community can tolerate or not. And so therefore, I mean, I think it's something that is bound to fail, that, for the kinds of conversations that we're having, the kinds of, questions that are important to us to move people, they have to start somewhere else besides, let's see, the community cannot accept this, so therefore we have to strategize to, you can't predetermine what what is respectable to the community. It has to come from somewhere else.
I think, Shakti, you were raising some really, really challenging questions to have. We throw these things out all the time, like we're not free till everyone's free. But then when there are people, when we talk about addiction or we think about things that we don't want to accept as part of our community or as part of what we envision for our future, then things start to get more messy and more exclusionary quick. And like, man, when I think about, harm reduction, even for me, connects to the disability justice kind of conversation that was happening earlier. Because it's that thing about how do we make spaces accessible and open and loving for all people. And harm reduction for me is about, like, I'm not making a judgment about what you do and what you don't do. I accept you're making the choices that are right for you. And I'm just trying to eliminate or minimize the possibility that that's going to kill you, you know? And how does that track with these more romantic, perhaps, or idealistic visions that I don't want to give up on? Because I mean, I think that to balance some of the grief and some of the difficulty, for me, it helps personally to be able to kind of think that there's something that we're helping to bring into material form through the more creative and the more ephemeral, you know, and that somehow that's generating an effect. But you're bringing up something that's really vital, you know, that really, it makes it hard to align that values and the actions piece when we're talking about issues like addiction. So I just want to thank you for bringing it up, because it's really important.
Yeah, I want to say something about respectability, but I want to touch on that last point there. Kind of, it's really crucial, Shakti, and your reflection on it, Melissa. But I also think that this is why, again, like, praxis is so vital to all of this, because maybe we can't, you know, go back and have a land trust, but maybe you can learn what something feels like in your body, right? You can feel something different through a practice, and that, again, can be a routing to a something else, or even un alivio, right? I mean, you know, to not even be too utopian about it, right? And I think that if we, that is the value in understanding these practices outside of, you know, a scope of like cultural nationalism, because, which again is attached to respectability, because then that actually, like, that actually allows us to access their transformative possibilities, as opposed to through like logics of representation, and you know, and I see William's questions in the chat, and hopefully we can get to those in a moment, but I think just to kind of like touch on the question of Bomba and respectability. I mean, that's huge. It's everything. I mean, that is the story of Bomba, you know, and that is the history of it. Like, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the kind of the story of the Union Club party, hosted in teens, where they were hosting a you know, some American admirals, and they brought Bomba performers, and it was horrible. It was like, how dare you represent us like this? How dare you, from both sides, right? From all political angles. How dare you embarrass yourself by representing yourself in this way, right? So Bomba is seen as the kind of like epitome of non-respectability, and then of course this is what creates a kind of distancing, distancing from the practice itself, even though it is also a myth that it was dead. It was never dead, and of course it was recuperated and relearned and re-injected with value by the hard work of the Cepedas and other people, but it you know, and it happened in a moment that was attached to statecraft and attached to the logics of respectability, right? So but what I find really interesting, if you actually sort of dig into the sartorial practices, the dress, and the movements themselves, right? I mean, there's a way to read it as like these performances of respectability, but I also think that there's something deeper there about ideas around order and disorder, and what it means to have control versus not control, right? And ideas around Africanity as this sort of, you know, fuera de control, you know, I mean, we've all seen it, the way that people initially respond to drums, or they initially respond to the idea of, bomba y plena, and then shaky, 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 right? And so it's like, it's this idea that it's a recognition of its disordering potential, but within that there is a very strong order and structuring logic. And I think that that's when you actually attend to the protocols of bomba, right? Bomba can in many ways sort of denounce this respectability, even as it's also ascribed to it in a lot of ways that we could get into. But when you actually attend to the protocols require respect, and like require respect in the way of like not necessarily asserting hierarchy, but so that this whole thing will work. Like, we can't actually do this if we're not all respecting each other, right? So it's a different articulation of what respect means. And again, it's sort of a counter humanity, a counter world vision, that if we, Barbara Badia, poses the question, what happens if bombas, what happens if we think of it as doing something other than representing the nation, right? Or even representing Black Puerto Rico. What can we learn about it, what it's doing, and what can we learn about the sort of the cultivation of Black worldviews and Black knowledges as this counter humanity that we can turn to, that we can look to as a strategy for undoing. And then, of course, and I'll answer to really briefly touch on William's question in the chat, which I can come back to also. But then and then that kind of respect requires that we sit in and actually think about, what does this mean in terms of the bodies that are showing up to do this, right? And it interrupts claims of like, pues mi abuela, it interrupts these claims of, well, I have a right because of this, right? It actually allows us to talk about the realities of anti-Blackness, and it allows for people to have their own relationship to it based on their own ancestry, but to not necessarily use that as a, as a script of Blackness, right? It kind of untethers it from that a little bit. But I think it's all steeped in respectability by the scene.
So I would we have so many wonderful questions. So Jade, thank you for bringing us to the Q&A. And so I'll just, for the rest of the panelists and for the audience, read out William Garcia Medina's question for you all. So William has 2 questions and also a comment, which was great conversation. So, but the question that Jade was already answering is this question of, how does the notion of bodies and performance end up in tandem with metaphysical ideas around heritage and ancestry? What are the limiting politics of tapping into your ancestry in ways that affects socio-political and economic realities, such as the tri-racial myth? How do scripts of Blackness, as coined by Isar Goudreau, limit our accessibility to our African heritage? Do people in the present have to be connected to those ancestros, not just metaphysically, but also via critical fabulations in order to respect that connection, right? So, and then just also William asked, do y'all have any reading recommendations in regards to the idea of communalism and performance from a decolonial dimension? These ideas are interesting. So I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that, but I think this question of his what we were talking about in terms of temporality and memory, right? Ancestral memory, right, I think is at the heart of this question that William is asking us to think about, right? Like, there's a way in which that historical memory and those attempts to recoup kind of ancestral memory are empowering, right? But there's also a way in which they work in very real ways to paper over racial difference, to disempower especially visibly racialized communities, right, in the archipelago and in the diaspora, right? So I don't know if anybody, Jade, I know you addressed it, if anybody else wants to try to address the question.
Just simply to say that, yes, there are disciplines such as Bomba, but there's oftentimes ancestral memory that is just, it's always been recovered. It's never quite there. It's never quite complete. It's never a thing, In terms of the demonstrations, I feel that one of the things that was, if you will, recovered or repeated was this whole idea that has happened in Puerto Rican culture throughout, of these kinds of practices that are improper and that erupt, all these kinds of, there are many instances of mourning practices that are judged improper. Of course, the muertos parados being one of the most prominent, as well as, el velorio being another, but they constantly reappear as a kind of rebellion against what stands, what is proper to be mourned, and who is properly a subject of mourning. And that constantly reappears in Puerto Rico, these improper moments, these moments that are judged by a lot of intellectuals as improper and as almost as signs of colonialism and why we're not a nation, a unified nation, But you can't, although this, some of you might see them as being repeated, they're never completely repeated. I mean, it's not as if there's a recipe and people just return to it, but there is an archive there somehow. And I don't know, the rest of you could, have probably more knowledge of this, but there is a somewhat of an archive that is being retrieved in these moments of rebellion, but it's not ready-made. It's not, it's not ever complete, and it doesn't repeat in the same way, That's always part of the challenge.
I mean, I think these are really powerful questions. Thank you, William. I can say, at least in this kind of Taino reclamation, it's like this question is also like there's a lot of, what I think is important when you do reclamation work is that there could be a real slippage and people say, oh, I'm Taino, but not acknowledge that whether they did or did not grow up with those traditions. And then the other piece about this kind of like, there's like the metaphysical, like I can connect to my ancestors, I can connect to a wisdom which is greater than me, which is there with me. But if I'm not also in community with people who are indigenous and would claim me as part of their community, then for me, there's a limitation, or there's a kind of falsity in like claiming a heritage out of what is a mixture that isn't easy for the majority of us to kind of pick apart. And I'm a believer that it is important for us to talk about and to understand how my skin color, how the other markers of me as racialized in society affect how I'm treated in different spaces, and to not to elide those distinctions in the interest of wanting to claim something from my past, which is important for me. Yeah, because it's definitely not a racial democracy up in here. So I think it's a really powerful and really multi-layered questions that you're giving us here. So thank you. That's just a little piece that I wanted to add.
Thank you. So I'm gonna just read Leslie Quintanilla's question here. Thank you to all the panelists and organizers of the symposium. I came in late, so apologies to Jade for missing her contribution. Context and question. I'm part of a large network of indigenous land defenders from Mexico and Central America trying to weave our relations with Borinquen. With indigeneity as an entryway, and so Melissa, this I think connects to the points you were just making, as an entryway to being / making solutions to the climate crisis. Are there any networks, movements, cultural workers, or orgs that are articulating themselves as indigenous land defenders on the archipelago?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I would say, trying to think of the name of Pluma Barbara's group, Canchibalo. There's let me see, Pluma Barbara she's definitely one of the leading indigenous activists in Puerto Rico. And she's a part of a group in Camji Lares, which is a center of mutual aid. So after the hurricanes, all of these centers for mutual aid popped up in different places across the island. But Camji Lares in particular is really drawing specific connections between the agrarian, rural, campesino landscape of Lares to the work that they're doing to organize politically. So that's one person that was always have to be my go-to when I'm thinking about land defenders in Borinquen. And then, from SEPA, we do a little bit of that work too, but always in consultation with some of the elders who we walk with in Hayuya. So you can feel free to reach out to me if you'd like some more info. And thanks for your work, because the land is everything. So it's important.
Thanks. So we have another question here from Michael Kusher. All of the talks today are so generative. And this actually relates to something we were talking about in the discussion about respectability politics, kind of about nation. If the nation has historically been built on a foundation of policing bodies and extracting the value of bodies for the benefits of the elite, I wonder if you can speak about the embodied politics of liberation. In other words, are the embodied practices we're discussing today a way of imagining new collectivities that are based on liberating bodies instead of caging and exploiting them? Is this talk about bodies helping us to move away from national structures of organization? Is this the goal? New anti-colonial forms of and new anti-colonial relations to each other and to other living things. So, and just if I can kind of also piggyback, because one of the kind of questions I had was about, like, how do we think about, scale, right? So, in thinking about the body, I think about the work of cultural and human geographers, right? But, the idea that the body is itself like a scale of analysis, right? And that then there's various other networks and relations that make up other scales of which the body is one, or in relation to these other scales. But what is, I guess, the scale of the body and thinking about the project of liberation, right? I think we're thinking about the individual, we're thinking about the community, but how do we think about this in terms of, and Melissa, I know this is a question that is your bread and butter, you think about every day, right? But how do we think about, I guess, scales of decolonization and the ways in which bodies individual and collective fit into that, if that makes sense.
So I actually have some thoughts about that. What am I trying to say? So it's such like so many expansive questions there, so many good questions. I think sort of thinking about embodied practices, moving against the status quo, and even, going back to challenging respectability. Part of what has been foundational for me in my work is reframing how I have understood addiction in our community, right? And it's really easy to think about drug use as pathological, right? Like we're an occupied nation, we're a colonized people, we are dealing with racism and poverty, and to sort of glom onto a different variation of cultures of poverty, right? It's like, well, of course we use drugs, we're sad, we're disenfranchised, and not drugs are a source of pleasure. Most people who use drugs don't have problematic use issues. Is it the drugs that have harmed our communities, or is it the war on people who use drugs, right? And how drugs are legislated and how communities of color are policed. If you look at the drug rates between white, non-Hispanic folks and people of color, there's not really a big difference, right? The difference is in the landscape of legislation and drug law enforcement. And so, I think there's been real interesting movements lately and people coming out for the legalization of drugs. And a lot of that has come about because our conversation has shifted, because it's been a rural opioid epidemic we're dealing with. And many would argue it's not a drug epidemic, it's a drug poisoning epidemic. What's happening to people is a tainted supply. There are things in the drugs that people don't know are in the drugs or are too strong for people. Fentanyl, xylazine, right? We have an overdose crisis, not an opioid crisis. And so I think sort of pushing forward, pleasure activism, right? A politics of pleasure and what does your body want? What does it enjoy? Some of the harm reduction that people engage with is not solely about people who are using IV drugs to get high, right? So a fair amount of people we speak to, they need syringes to inject hormones, right? They're undergoing maybe informal gender affirmation processes. People who use steroids, right? Other kinds of harm reduction for people who use amphetamines or uppers because they're day laborers and their bodies are in pain and they need to keep going. And so I think removing that sort of sense of drug use as a pathological harm or ill, and it's caused by harms or ills that have been done to our communities, and rethinking how we approach that is a big way to understand the political potential, the radical potential of embodying a practice of harm reduction and radical embrace of drug users.
Yeah, that reminds me, I'm forgetting her name, but the person in the disability justice who was talking about the dramaturge piece of El Loco que se volvió cuerdo was talking about myth making and how like there are systems of diagnostics which are out there saying creating pathology where maybe there isn't. And so I think that's a really powerful way to think about shifting like away from that frame. The reframe is crucial. And I do think for me, like at least when I'm thinking about embodiment and what we're trying to build, for sure is about collective liberation and new communities through these kinds of practices. And I'm particularly not sad. I love Boriquen. I love this archipelago. I love the people. And I think like PRSA or Puerto Rican studies in particular is to my mind, really like a lot of people in it are Puerto Ricans, which is like, we're really invested in changing how people are thinking about like our communities. But I'm not really interested in the nation. Like, I think like the liberation that we need now is not going to be determined by nation, like the borders of nation. Like, we need, the collective liberation goes much beyond that frame. So from whatever practice or from whatever intent you're trying to cultivate alternatives, for me, it's never about that. The current landscape requires us to think much more broadly about how we need each other, you know.
Yeah, thanks for that last point, Melissa, because I was gonna the question came right after Leslie's comment. And I was thinking that actually, I think, you know, scale requires us to think beyond, to think to our attachments beyond the bounds of the nation, right? And it like, yeah, it depends on it. But also it's about, you know, our quotidian realities too. Like, who are we in community with? Who are we sharing time and space with? You know, to Shakti's point about like the immediate realities is what's you know, what we need to attend to. And I'm trying to take this back to, you know, the question here about you know, yes, is this a goal? I think we're saying it is a goal, right? Yeah. It is a goal to find other structures of organization, but that necessitate our understanding of, you know, people who you know, and either across some waters or across you know, other nations, and I think that, again, you know, I feel like this is my role in this panel here today, but I think that these practices can actually do that for us, right? I think they can actually put us into the spaces where we come to know each other in that way, and to know about each other in that way, because then it becomes something that's embodied, right? And it allows us to think differently, to have access to different networks, all of that. Yeah, eso es lo que quiero decir.
Thank you. So we have one question. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Arnaldo.
Yeah, just very briefly, just, you know, that the question has to do, I would phrase it in another way, agreeing with everyone else, that the question has to do with sovereignty. That's a very complicated, complex thing, but that there are multiple ways in which people are claiming sovereignty and reframing sovereignty, whether personal, I mean, bodily sovereignty, or sovereignty, you know, of a space, of the nation, you know. So yeah, it's about that. Okay.
Thank you. So we have like 4 minutes left. So we can start wrapping up here. And I just have there's one question that didn't make it into the Q&A from Jess Pabon that I just want to throw out there. And if folks want to kind of address it in any way, you know, we can kind of close with this one. But Jess said, I wanted to pull on the thread Arnaldo presented on regarding ephemera via Jose Munoz, who offers us a frame of a kind of invisible trace. I was thinking it would be lovely if the panel could just expand on this notion. So the notion of the trace, how bomba dancing relies on the dynamic of following traces, only audible to drummer and dancer, traces of indigeneity and language and such that Melissa brought up, traces of community care, the users can see and others cannot, the sharps containers, for example. So if anybody has kind of comments about this idea of the trace, or if like the role of ephemera, really, right? These kind of fleeting moments, but please.
Well, let me just say that yeah, it's well, that, I mean, I almost identify with joy, that's, being able to somehow connect to some of those and reinterpret some of those traces, especially, for people who do not have a readily made archive, is a way to not only for you to connect, but also to incite others and to create that kind of river of multiple back and forth of syncopated movement. Yeah, that's my thought.
William brought up earlier critical fabulation, right? And I think that there's an invitation with that to follow a trace, and to experiment also. And there's a great deal of creativity too, I think, in that, right? I mean, and there's with the gestures, we imitate, right? We're imitators. We place other people's bodies in ours, and we place ourselves in other people's bodies, right? We place their embodiments, we inhabit their embodiments as a way to learn. And we take on those traces and we inhabit them, but we create them anew. And I think that there's a really powerful generative creative force there as well, that is about experimentation and that is about play, because that is not foreclosed, right? That is but that also remains porous to someone else's critical fabulation.
I don't have anything super provocative, but I did want to thank you, Jess, for it, because personally, when I listened to Marisol read it, my hair stood up. And so maybe that's just what I wanted to share about that invisible trace. There's in the element of the air, or there's something around us that if we're present to it, it can lead us somewhere else. And yeah, thank you.
So it is one. I want to thank everyone who has stayed with us on this fine Friday afternoon. Stick around. We have a half-hour break, and then we're going to reconvene for our business meeting. We're going to have a lot of really exciting updates about the conference for 2024, new elections, and just updates also about finances, membership, all of that fun stuff. So please stick around. The webinar will stay open, and we'll just reconvene at in half an hour. So thank you so much to the panelists for just this incredibly thought-provoking and evocative just plenary session. This was really incredible, and I think connected so well to the discussion we've been having all day. So thank you all, and I'll see.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Gracias.
Thank you.